Just southwest of Chicago, past the bend at Harlem Avenue, a street leaves the city to run through the outlying industrial towns of Bedford Park and Summit to villages further south, and ultimately to the heavily forested Palos Division of the Forest Preserve District of Cook County. It is an old road, originally an Indian trail with its origins on the shore of Lake Michigan in Chicago's present day Chinatown. The road takes its name from one of the most important events in American history and runs, too, through the imaginations of many, both skeptics and believers. For there is a magic along its path which generations have longed to hold or try to dispel. It's a highway populated with ghosts and a road flooded with the tears of laborers, murder victims, and the countless mourners who have carried their dead to the 7 cemeteries which flank it. That old road, built up by Irish workers on the Illinois and Michigan Canal in the 1830s and 40s, has established itself as no less than the magnetic center of Chicago's supernatural forces. It's known today as one of the most haunted roads on earth. That road is Archer Avenue. Ghostlorist Michael Clean and I both independently coined the term the Archer Avenue Triangle to describe the area bounded by Archer on the hypotenuse side of that ethereal region. For over a century and a half, strange tales have been told of this part of the Chicago Southland, tales including those of haunted houses, disembodied voices and music, phantom cars, and no less than Chicago's most famous ghost, the wayfaring dancer known as Resurrection Mary, a story for another day. This haunted land ranks rightfully high on the bucket lists of ghost hunters the world over. The things they come so far to find never disappoint. The anchor of Archer Avenue's preternatural notoriety is a wildly sloping churchyard. The oldest established cemetery in the county, its acreage seems to mark the southern end of the haunted portion of Archer Avenue, just north of the old Sag quarries, where the Cal-Sag Channel and the Des Plaines River rendezvous. Like Archer Avenue itself, the parish and its cemetery date to the early 1800s, when Irish canal builders, most of them from the town of Bridgeport, now Chicago, put down this road along the route of the Illinois and Michigan Canal under the direction of Colonel William B. Archer. Construction of the canal, financially cursed from the outset, resulted in frequent periods of unemployment for the would-be workers, who often labored under slave-like conditions of thirst and hunger, disease, infighting, and death. Nonetheless, they built the road and they built the canal. Many of them moved southwest of the city to live and die along their Archer Avenue, and ultimately to be buried in the bluffside burial ground that grew up there, a churchyard called St. James of Sag Bridge, or simply St. James Sag. Sag Bridge is a vanished village now. Only its church and graveyard remain. Though many believed the town would grow into a major center of commerce and industry in the United States, that distinction would go instead to Chicago, the bustling settlement at Fort Dearborn, at the mouth of the Chicago River. Legends abound regarding the sacred nature of this site, which was reportedly a French signal fort in the days of French exploration of the American interior, a site where Marquette and Joliet stopped on their travels, and where Père Marquette celebrated Mass. An earlier church stood here in those days, replaced later by the current limestone structure, the cornerstone of which was laid in 1853 and which took local men 6 years to complete. Tradition has long told that an Indian burial ground preceded the European burial ground here, another possibility often brought to explain the site's impressive host of hauntings. Supernatural events have been reported at St. James Sag since at least 1847, when phantom monks were first seen gliding up this bluff along Archer near its intersection with the Sanitary and Ship Canal, the Illinois and Michigan Canal, the Des Plaines River, and the Cal-Sag Channel. 130 years later, in November of 1977, a Cook County sheriff was passing the grounds late one night and reportedly saw 8 hooded figures floating from the adjacent woods towards the rectory. As he pursued what he assumed to be pranksters, the figures moved towards the top of the hill and vanished. The sighting of those phantom friars long ago earned the church's social hall, with its earlier castellated roof, the name of Monk's Castle in local lore, though no record exists of brothers ever living here. The priests who have made their home at this sacred site, however, have had their own stories to tell. An early pastor, Father James Bowman, claimed to regularly witness the cemetery ground rising and falling, as if the entire landscape were one great body of water, or as if the earth were breathing. The unmistakable sound of Gregorian chant has also been heard in the vicinity, and a ghost light has been reported, bobbing among the tombstones. While buried in microfilm at the Chicago Public Library one day in 1996, I came upon the bizarre experience of 2 young Chicago musicians, which was detailed in both the Chicago Tribune and the local Lamont Observer of September 30th, 1897. St. James's pastor had decided to hold a fundraising fair at the church. In order to attract the younger parishioners, Father Bowman had hired 2 Chicago musicians, William Looney and John Kelly, to provide harp and flute music for the affair. Afterwards, exhausted from the long night of playing to a big crowd, the 2 musicians decided to bed down on the upper floor of the church's parish hall, Saginaw Hall, which was at the time a frame building located at the west end of the parking lot on the parish grounds. Settling in on bedrolls sometime after 1 o'clock in the morning, the 2 looked forward to a sound sleep. For Looney, however, sleep wouldn't come. The chilly night and the bright moonlight kept the musician tossing and turning until he was alerted to a commotion outside, the unmistakable galloping and rumbling of a horse and carriage. Curious about the frantic nature of the sound, Looney ran to the window to observe the scene. But although the sound from the road continued with increasing strength, no horse or carriage could be seen. Perplexed and quite shaken, Looney awakened his friend and told him of the incident. As he told the tale, the sound began again, growing in strength as before. This time, both men stood at the window, searching the landscape for a sign of the carriage. What they finally saw was something quite unexpected. In the middle of the road stood a tall, young woman in white. Her hands were raised and moving above her head of tangled dark hair. The 2 men would later comment that she seemed filled with despair. Sensing something amiss, the men were on the verge of calling out to her when, to their shock, she floated through the cemetery fence and began wandering around the tombstones. Soon, the sound of the carriage began again. At last, the sound produced a visual counterpart as the musicians watched the approach of galloping horses, which were, in their own word, snow white and covered with a fine netting. A light of electric brilliance shone from the forehead of each. The animals preceded a carriage, a dark vehicle of solemn outline. No driver could be seen. As the transport approached the dance hall, the woman returned to the road. Then, as the carriage whipped past her, a shadow enveloped her, and she began sinking into the center until she was swallowed up. Silenced by the spectacle, Looney and Kelly froze as the sound of the horses returned yet again, and the woman reappeared. Finally, when the horses and carriage materialized for the second time, the woman called out, "Come on!" waved her hand once more, and disappeared into the ground. Badly shaken, the two men left their window post for their cots, where they waited in fear through the night. In the morning, they took their story to local police. In response to these testimonies, Marshal Cohen of the sanitary police admitted that both of the witnesses, quote, obviously saw something which impressed them greatly. I do not believe there is anything of a practical joke in the affair. That would be dangerous in this locality. Everyone out here carries weapons since the rough characters have been brought in with the building of the canal. It would be tempting death to try to such a thing. For any person so foolish would be likely to receive a bullet. Both of these men are sober fellows. There was no liquor at the dance. I believe these boys are telling the truth. Some legends maintain that the haunting scene witnessed by Looney and Kelly in 1897 was the result of an elopement attempt gone awry. According to lore, a young priest came to St. James in the 1880s to serve as an assistant to the pastor, and shortly won the affections of one of the pastor's housekeepers. Unable to fight their feelings for one another, the couple decided to run away and be married. Late one night, the young man hitched up the team of horses and advised his fiancée to await him halfway down the hill. As the young man stepped down to help her board the carriage, however, the animals suddenly bolted. Tragically, the carriage overturned on top of the couple. They were both crushed by the weight and buried together on an unmarked plot at St. James Sag. Those who believe in this tale and the ensuing haunting assume that the couple was forever doomed to reenact their elopement as punishment for the young priest's abandonment of his priesthood. The late great historian Kenan Heiss documented the supernaturality of a phantom hearse carriage in his book Resurrection Mary, A Ghost Story, and he wrote about the ongoing sightings of a phantom hearse along Archer near St. James, even in the 1970s. He wrote, "The terror of the hearse rips a hole in the frightened soul of anyone who has ever encountered it." And he recounted that residents of the region still claim to see it along Archer Avenue between Resurrection and St. James Sag cemeteries, a stretch where one may leave the road and wander through the forest to the old Archer Woods burial ground on Keene Avenue. According to descriptions given to Hayes by locals, the vehicle is built of black oak and glass, through which the unsuspecting viewer might glimpse its ghastly cargo, the luminous casket of a child. Driverless, its horses hurl the carriage through the darkness with the panting of creatures trying to escape hell itself. The thrilling stories of St. James have made it a natural attraction for local teenagers over the years, who have flocked to the site for generations under cover of darkness, hoping for a glimpse of the phantom monks and the other wraiths said to be seen here. Locals tell that these late-night expeditions became so bothersome at one point that priests serving at the parish took to dressing up in robes to chase the encroachers away. Trespassers were caught and forced to kneel on broom handles, salt, or stones for hours in penance for their trespass. Another Mr. Kelly was at the center of supernatural shenanigans at the Sag in 1897 when the skeletons of Indians were unearthed on the land of the Kelly brothers, just north of St. James Church on the bluff inside present-day Redgate Woods. A total of 4 skeletons were found, with only the skulls in a state of decent preservation, along with flint spearheads, mortars, and grinding stones for grinding corn and shells, which were believed to have been used for money. When the discovery went public the following week, Kelly made an extraordinary announcement to the press. He said that 9 years earlier, he had discovered a similar skeleton on his property and took it to his house, wanting to preserve it. In the days that followed, strange things happened on his farm, including sounds of such a weird and uncanny character as to arouse the fears of his family, who connected them with the grim skeleton. Kelly decided to put the skeleton back where he had found it, and after doing so, no more activity was experienced. But after Kelly's second excavation, anthropologists from Chicago's Field Columbian Museum, today's Field Museum of Natural History, swept in to take over, and the skeletons ended up in the permanent collections of the museum, probably raising a ruckus there, which may be still part of the many hauntings of the place today. The limestone quarries of the Sag Bridge area and other parts of the Southland are so closely connected to Chicago's history that it's hard to tell the city's tale without telling the story of that buttery yellow stone, and impossible to tell our ghost stories without delving into these now water-filled and stony depths. In the 19th century, when Chicago was burgeoning, no stone was more appealing than our local limestone. Hailing from this region just southwest of the city, beginning near Sag Bridge, Lamont limestone and Joliet limestone from the area a bit further south became the most desirable building materials in Illinois. Its soft hue and appearance joined with a stability that made the stone irresistible to many builders in Chicago, including architects who designed some of Chicago's most recognizable and haunted 19th century structures. The presence of limestone at any ostensibly haunted site sends up the antenna of most modern paranormal researchers, who seem to be constantly looking for limestone as a culprit in reports of the paranormal, believing that its presence can somehow explain everything from apparitions to footsteps and cold spots. Limestone is believed to influence the electromagnetic field, holding on to energy from the past. This theory is known as the stone tape theory, from the 1970s era British film The Stone Tape. According to believers in it, the stone tape phenomenon can include ghost lights, cold spots, visual, audio, and even olfactory apparitions, and more. Indeed, visitors to quarries and to buildings made of limestone often report euphoric feelings, physical illness, which can be the result of high EM levels. In Chicago, many of our limestone buildings are reputedly haunted, including Holy Name Cathedral, the gate of Rose Hill Cemetery, and that mysterious church on the bluff at Sag Bridge. Doubtless, the most iconic of Chicago's Lamont limestone structures is the Chicago Water Tower, enduring and haunted emblem of the city, and indeed one of the only structures to survive the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. However, Chicago's limestone has an additional ingredient beyond any natural ability to encourage the ghostly activity. And that story starts, like many of Chicago's stories, along the building route of the Illinois and Michigan Canal. The I&M Canal remains one of the most significant engineering projects in American history, as it effectively opened the portage that had existed between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River, thereby clearing a water trade route between the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico. Such a project had been envisioned as early as the 17th century, when Pere Marquette and Louis Joliet traveled through the Chicago portage, with the latter remarking that the French could create a North American empire if the passage could be opened to allow for trading. It was Stephen Long, however, who in 1816 finally surveyed the portage to propose the actual endeavor. Two others, Nathaniel Pope and Ninian Edwards, supported the initiative, suggesting that the border of Illinois be moved north from the tip of Lake Michigan to allow the canal to be built entirely in one state, the future state of Illinois. Despite having an insufficient number of residents to apply for statehood, their proposal won Illinois just that. Construction on the canal began in 1836, but the Panic of 1837 soon threw a wrench into the works and forced the Canal Commission to borrow money from East Coast banks and even British investors. As for the hard labor, it was performed primarily by Irish immigrants, most of whom had earlier worked to build the famed Erie Canal. The work conditions have gone down in Chicago legend. Canal workers, being already Irish and then manual laborers, were considered subhuman by many, adding insult to the physical injury of the deplorable condition. Hunger, thirst, infighting, and disease, much of it from the ill funding of the project, led to countless deaths along the canal building route, which trudged along the ancient Indian Trail that later became Archer Avenue, named after Colonel William B. Archer, the canal project commissioner. It was during the blasting of stubborn rock with dynamite during the canal building that workers found the rich deposits of Niagara limestone, which became such a Chicago hallmark. According to Southwest Side legend, early immigrants without families to care for the remains of the dead canal workers were cremated rather than buried. Those stories tell that their cremains were scattered over the stone quarries of Sag Bridge and Lamont, near the canal route that had taken their lives. I am uncertain about the truth of this, as St. James Sag was well known for giving free burials to anyone who could not afford them, and yet the legend remains, as does another. A few years ago now, I was delighted to come across an old copy of a cookbook for sale on eBay. The book was called 125 Years in the Kitchen and was one of those parish cookbooks that churches often put together with family recipes shared by parishioners. Unlike many of these kinds of books, which tend to be spiral bound, this was a hardbound book and also contained several sections throughout it telling the story of the parish in words and old photographs. It was here, in fact, where I discovered the origins of the nickname of Monk's Castle and a photograph of the castellated old church hall, Saginaw Hall. This was a great and happy surprise, to be sure, but this wasn't the only revelation the book would hold. The history also told of the mammoth job of quarrying and transporting the limestone used for the building of the parish church. The stone was hauled from the Sag quarries south of the church site, which today are filled with water and part of the Forest Preserve District of Cook County. Father George Aschenbrender, pastor of St. James at the time of the cookbook's publication, shared a tragic parish ghost story tied to the quarries. In particular, the Minogue quarry, the one which provided the stone for St. James Church. Father Aschenbrender wrote, "Two close friends, Mrs. Flynn and Mrs. Minogue, were returning home from church one late, dark, and starless night. After crossing the old bridge over the Calsag Channel, they wandered into the quarry area and were both drowned. One version of the story says their bodies were not found until some weeks later. Thereafter, the quarry became known as the Minogue Quarry. Whether the haunting of Chicago's limestone structures can be connected to the quarries, the canalers, or both, is anyone's guess today. But there can be little doubt that a foundation stone of Chicago was hauled from the mysterious quarries of the Sag, and the toil of the canal workers who literally opened the way for a Chicago only dreamed of by those who traveled the earlier portage. Before we leave the legendary limestone crannies of Sag Bridge, we must tell one more ghost story, another truth I discovered in that old dear cookbook. For as I turned eagerly through the pages of history, I was astonished to discover these words. Quote, Prior to 1970, the grounds of St. James, and particularly the entranceway, were quite open. But several years ago, we were able to obtain the magnificent main gate of the Hawthorne plant of Western Electric in Cicero, Illinois. End quote. That plant was the place of work of the hundreds of men and women who perished with their families in the horrific Eastland disaster of 1915, when the Eastland steamer tipped over on the Chicago River just prior to its departure on the Western Electric Company's picnic cruise. 844 souls, including 22 entire families, perished in the unspeakable tragedy. Today, the ghosts of the Eastland disaster are some of the most well-known in Chicago's supernatural history. But few know that some of that tragedy, and perhaps even some of its spirited residue, reside in this quiet churchyard on Archer Avenue. I myself came face to face with the deeply spiritual nature of St. James Sag some years ago now, when I was leading a bus full of ghost hunters on tour through a frigid early December night. My co-host, the Chicago paranormal investigator Ed Shanahan, had arranged a tour of the church for us before our planned dinner at Chet's Melody Lounge across from Resurrection Cemetery, a place tied in legend to the road's famed vanishing hitchhiker. But we'd had bus trouble since picking up our passengers in downtown Chicago. The transmission was failing, and we spoke to the driver with concern as our transport was moving barely half the speed limit on the highway as we made our way down to the old Sag Bridge region. The driver told us he'd radioed for a replacement to be driven down to meet us. He'd switch buses with the new vehicle while we toured the church, he said. But we never made it. The bus stalled and stopped in the middle of the road, within a dark and winding stretch of Archer known as the Stretch of Death for the many deadly accidents along that part of it. Ed and I looked at each other, him at the front of the bus and I at the back. We both knew just how vulnerable to such a fate we were, sitting there on that notorious roadway in the darkness of that winter night. We knew we needed to get off that bus. Thankfully, we were just yards from the entrance to St. James Churchyard, and so we carefully led our passengers across the dark road and began the climb up the hill to the church at the top of the bluff. While making that trek, we heard suddenly a huge sound behind us. Crash, followed by an explosion. A car, going much too fast, had slammed into the back of our bus. We found out later that the vehicle had rolled over several times in the woods abutting the road, and that the driver had crawled out of the flames on his hands and knees. Our driver had crossed the road to call the bus company and had also mercifully lived. Both the bus and the car were destroyed by fire. Later, at dinner, our passengers passed around photographs taken of the accident scene. We had somehow all escaped with our lives. One of them showed something truly inexplicable. Above the wreckage of the bus, the blaze now extinguished, an enormous ball of light seemed to hover in the air. It was, we all agreed, as if all of our guardian angels had somehow joined together to ensure we were spared from disaster. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of The Ghostlorist. It means everything to me that you're here to support my work. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, share it. It means everything to for YouTube to make my videos more visible to others. And please put in the comments what you think of the videos, what you like about them, what you think could be improved, and let me know what stories you'd like me to cover on the channel. I love to dive deeply into stories that I know and stories that I don't know. And I'd love to do some more research for you and share with you what I find. Thanks again for being here. I will see you next time right here on the Ghostlorist. And until then, remember to pray for ghosts. I'm Ursula Bielski. See you next time.